Imagine waking up on Christmas morning and your pregnant wife is simply gone. No note, no goodbye, no trace. That was Scott Peterson's story on December 24, 2002. His wife Laci, 8 months pregnant, days away from giving birth to their son, vanished without a single explanation. He told police he had gone fishing that morning, alone, on a cold, gray bay. On Christmas Eve, and America listened. And then America stopped believing him. Because 4 months later, Lassai's body washed ashore in the San Francisco Bay, and so did her unborn baby boy. The nation was shattered. Scott Peterson was arrested, tried, and convicted of killing the two people he had promised to love and protect. He was sentenced to death. But here's where the story refuses to end. More than 20 years later, lawyers are standing in courtrooms, waving new science, new timelines, and new theories, all pointing to one explosive claim: that Scott Peterson could not have done it. And just weeks ago, in 2026, a judge made a ruling that has once again set the entire country on fire. But what this judge said and what it means for Scott, for justice, and for Lassai's memory is something no one saw coming. Stay with me, because this story is far from over. To understand where we are in 2026, you need to understand who Laci Peterson was. She wasn't just a headline. She was a real woman, warm, funny, and glowing with the kind of joy that only comes when life feels exactly right. Laci Denise Rocha grew up in Modesto, California. She loved to cook. She loved her family. She had a smile that people remember decades later. By 2002, she was 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, and married to a man she believed was her soulmate, a fertilizer salesman named Scott Peterson. From the outside, their life looked like a dream. They had a beautiful home. They had chosen a name for their baby boy, Connor. Laci had already set up the nursery, but something was quietly rotting underneath that perfect surface. What the world didn't know, what Laci herself may not have fully known, was that Scott Peterson had been living a double life. He was having an affair with a massage therapist named Amber Frey. And when Laci disappeared, Amber became the key that unlocked everything. On December 24, 2002, Scott left home claiming he was going fishing at the Berkeley Marina, over 90 miles from their house. Hours later, Laci was reported missing by her mother. The search was immediate, frantic, heartbreaking. Volunteers flooded the streets of Modesto holding flyers with Laci's face on them. Candles were lit, prayers were said, and the entire country held its breath. But as weeks turned into months, suspicion began quietly circling Scott Peterson. He seemed cold in interviews. Almost too calm. He had purchased a boat just weeks before Laci disappeared, a boat he had never mentioned to friends or family. And when detectives looked closer, they found a hair inside that boat, a hair that matched Laci's. The picture that emerged was devastating. And then on April 13, 2003, a man walking near the shore of San Francisco Bay found a small body washed onto the rocks. It was a baby boy. The next day, a woman's torso was found nearby. It was Laci. America didn't just mourn, America demanded justice. Scott Peterson was arrested on April 18, 2003, just days after the bodies were found, caught in San Diego, his hair bleached, carrying his brother's ID and nearly $15,000 in cash. He was running. At trial in 2004, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder for Laci and second-degree murder for baby Connor. He was sentenced to death, and that, most people thought, was the end. But what happened next changed everything. For years, Scott Peterson sat on death row at San Quentin State Prison, maintaining his innocence. Most people didn't care. As far as the public was concerned, the jury had spoken. The evidence had spoken. Scott Peterson was exactly where he belonged, but then something shifted. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence, not because they doubted his guilt, but because of errors in how the jury was selected during his original trial. It was a legal technicality, but it gave Peterson's supporters a sliver of hope. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And then in 2024, something happened that nobody expected. The Los Angeles Innocence Project, a nonprofit organization that fights for people they believe were wrongfully convicted, took on Scott Peterson's case. This was not a small thing. The LA Innocence Project does not take cases lightly. They review thousands of requests and accept only those where they believe there is a genuine chance of injustice. Their involvement sent a clear message. They believed something had gone wrong in Scott Peterson's trial, and the claims they started raising were stunning. They said the science used to convict Scott Peterson was outdated and unreliable. They pointed to ultrasound research from 1984, technology that was decades old even at the time of the trial, that had been used to determine exactly when baby Connor died. The prosecution's case was built on a very specific date, December 23, 2002. That was the night Scott and Laci were home alone together. If Laci was killed on December 23rd, Peterson's own attorneys had conceded at trial, Scott is the only person who could have reasonably killed her. But now, the Innocence Project was arguing that modern science told a completely different story. New research, they claimed, showed that Connor could have died significantly later, possibly up to 12 days after Laci first disappeared. If that was true, if the timeline was wrong, then the entire foundation of the prosecution's case would crumble, and the implications of that possibility were almost too large to process. But the truth behind this was even more surprising than anyone realized. The Innocence Project didn't stop at the science. They dug deeper. And the more they dug, the more they claimed they were finding things that should have been heard at trial, things the jury never knew about. One of the most jaw-dropping details involved a burned van. According to the Innocence Project, a van had been discovered near the Petersons' neighborhood around the time Laci vanished. Inside that van, a mattress. The kind of detail that, in a case built on where and when a body was dumped, raises questions that cannot be easily ignored. They also raised the possibility that Laci may have witnessed a burglary taking place near her home on that very morning, December 24th. That, if true, could mean strangers had a reason to silence her, a reason that had nothing to do with Scott Peterson. None of this had been presented to the jury. And that omission, the Innocence Project argued, had denied Scott Peterson a fair trial. Then there was the question of the body itself. A new scientific study submitted as part of Peterson's appeal challenged where and how Laci's remains arrived at the location where they were found in the San Francisco Bay. The prosecution had relied on the fact that her body washed up in the same area where Scott had gone fishing, a powerful, damning coincidence that helped seal his conviction. But the new study, the defense claimed, disputed whether the currents and conditions of the bay were even consistent with the body traveling the way prosecutors described. By August of 2025, the Innocence Project had formally filed a habeas corpus petition, a legal challenge arguing that Scott Peterson had been wrongfully convicted. The petition contained 14 separate claims, 14 reasons they argued why the verdict should not stand. America paid attention again, podcasts exploded with new episodes. Comment sections on true crime forums became battlegrounds. People who had spent 20 years certain of Peterson's guilt suddenly found themselves asking questions they didn't expect to ask. And then A&E announced a full 4-hour docuseries, titled Scott Peterson, the new evidence, promising to examine every one of these claims in detail with cameras, experts, and the most up-to-date information available. The story that everyone thought was over was suddenly, shockingly alive again, but no one was prepared for what the judge was about to say. On April 28, 2026, just weeks ago, California Superior Court Judge Elizabeth Hill issued her ruling, and it was not what the Innocence Project had hoped for. In a sweeping 116-page decision, Judge Hill rejected every single one of Scott Peterson's 14 claims. Every single one. She found that the evidence presented was not truly new. She found that many of the claims were procedurally barred under California law, meaning they were too late to be raised at this stage of the legal process. And for the claims that were reviewed on their merits, she found they lacked the legal weight to overturn a conviction. In her words, there was nothing new, admissible, nor material in what the defense had presented. The San Mateo County District Attorney, Jeff Logero, issued a statement shortly after, saying the appellate process had worked exactly as it was designed to. The process, he said, worked for Laci's family, for her mother Sharon Rocha, who has spent more than 2 decades fighting to protect her daughter's memory. This ruling must have felt like vindication. But for the Innocence Project, it felt like a closed door being slammed shut in the face of justice. Paula Mitchell, the director of the LA Innocence Project, did not back down. She called the ruling deeply flawed. She said the court had misunderstood the legal standards that apply to habeas corpus cases. She said that strong exculpatory evidence that could have changed everything, had been wrongly dismissed as inadmissible. And she made one thing absolutely clear: they were not finished. Scott Peterson, now 53 years old, remains locked inside Mule Creek State Prison in California, a man who has maintained his innocence for more than 2 decades. A man whose case has been reviewed, appealed, and denied at nearly every turn. And yet, the legal machinery is still moving. There is still a separate appeal pending before the California Supreme Court. It challenges not the evidence, but the behavior of the jury itself. Specifically, claims of juror misconduct that Peterson's team argues denied him a fair hearing from the very beginning. That appeal has not been decided, and that means the final chapter has not been written. Here is the question that splits America every single time this case resurfaces. What if Scott Peterson is actually innocent? It sounds almost impossible to say out loud. The man had an affair. He was caught running hair-bleached, pockets full of cash, driving under his brother's name. The hair in the boat, the body in the bay, the fishing trip on Christmas Eve. The evidence felt overwhelming, but the history of wrongful convictions in America is full of cases that also felt overwhelming. And the deeper you look at the Peterson case, the more you find things that cannot be easily explained away. The timeline, if the new science is correct, shifts in ways that don't fit the prosecution's story. The burned van near the neighborhood has never been fully explained. The possibility that Laci witnessed something that made strangers want her silenced, has never been seriously investigated in public. None of that means Scott Peterson is innocent. But it raises a question that the justice system is supposed to take seriously. What if the jury convicted the wrong man? The LA Innocence Project will now take their fight to a higher court, arguing that Judge Hill got the law wrong, that exculpatory evidence cannot simply be dismissed as procedurally barred when a man's life and freedom are at stake. Meanwhile, the California Supreme Court sits with a pending appeal over juror misconduct, a claim that has already led to one prior ruling in Peterson's favor. When a juror was previously found to have withheld information during the selection process, the prosecution has always maintained that Peterson's guilt is clear, that the evidence speaks for itself, and that 20 years of failed appeals prove the system has reviewed the case thoroughly and reached the right answer. But somewhere in a prison cell in California, a 53-year-old man wakes up every morning and tells anyone who will listen that he did not kill his wife. And somewhere, Laci Peterson's family wakes up every morning carrying a grief that no ruling, no appeal, and no documentary can ever touch. The Laci Peterson case has never really gone away. It is one of those stories that lodged itself permanently into the American memory. A young woman, a baby boy, a Christmas morning, and a mystery that, depending on who you ask, was either solved in 2004 or is still waiting to be solved today. What we know in May of 2026 is this: Scott Peterson's latest appeal has been denied. His attorneys are preparing to take the fight to a higher court. A docuseries is on the way. And the California Supreme Court has not yet ruled on the juror misconduct claim. The case is alive. Whether justice was served or whether justice still owes a debt to someone is a question that America refuses to stop asking. Laci Peterson deserved better than the fate she received. Her son Connor never had the chance to take his first breath. Whatever the truth is, they deserve to be remembered with dignity and love. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Scott Peterson is guilty, and that 20 years of failed appeals prove the system got it right? Or do you think there are too many unanswered questions to be certain? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story hit you the way it hits so many people, if this case is one you've followed for years, subscribe to this channel. We cover the cases that stay with you long after the cameras move on.